Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have Professor Stefan Schreiber. He's a professor of medicine at Christian Albrecht University in Kiel, Germany. He's in the Department of Internal Medicine, and he's at the University Medical Center Schleswig-Holstein. We're going to talk about bowel diseases. And,
Hi, Richard. This is impressive how you spell these complicated German words.
I'm trying. Thank you. Well, very good. Tell me about your research and your work. What do you do there?
I'm here what you would call an academic gastrologist, which means I do see patients more than I like. So I see patients for the entire field of gastroenterology, although my personal hobby is very clearly inflammatory bowel disease. And then on the other hand, I do have the chance to do quite some research, mainly in the molecular etiology and the biomarkers of inflammatory bowel disease. And so I think we are running big cohort studies for both discovery and also for implementing new therapies. We have been part of many of the phase 2, 1, 2, and 3 trials of newer agents, and also created some ideas on our own that now go clinical.
So what are the major inflammatory bowel diseases?
Basically two that comprise most of the phenotypes, ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. And you can enlarge that group by adding lymphocytic colitis and microscopic colitis into that, and collagenous colitis. Maybe also you can further enhance that space by saying that the inflammatory forms of irritable bowel syndrome should be also a kind of inflammatory bowel disease. I think most people talk about Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis as two main phenotypes, and that's what I think is the usual clinical wisdom.
So you're looking for biomarkers that would say that someone has it or is going to get it in the next few years?
I think that's the holy grail, to find out who's about to get it. So we have done molecular etiology studies at large with 10,000s of patients in big collaborations. And I think inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease namely, but both diseases actually have played out great. They were paradigm examples for the human genetics work in complex diseases, showing really can annotate early or etiology factors, genetic variants that lend risk to individuals to develop the disease. But then if you break that down to the individual and go and leave the cohort, then these effects are small. They may be highly significant, but the odds ratio, if they approach 2, is already much. And you cannot do much with an odds ratio of 2 for something you eventually may get into your life. And if you break it then down to the terms of specificity and sensitivity, then you also find that the specificity of the findings is not great. So if you look at the overall distributions of inflammatory bowel disease-related variants, you find that probably 30% of the population carries quite some of them, but only 0.5%, that's a lifetime prevalence, will get inflammatory bowel disease. So having the variant or not doesn't tell you much. So you need other things, and we are about to look for them, functional things. We look into families where the children develop inflammatory bowel disease, a much higher likelihood. We take blood from them, we take molecular samples, and hope that we'll find enough patients traveling from health into manifestation to allow us to do something earlier, find an earlier functional genomic marker. But that's not there yet. But I think the disease etiology research has been not useless. It has changed our view from inflammatory bowel disease being an autoimmune problem into one that this disease is a rather defensive problem, and that the microbiome plays a big role, because many indeed of the etiology factors have nothing to do with autoimmunity. They have to do with barrier keeping. So that has changed our view, that changes medication development. And in another 10 years, it will lead to a different generation of medications also out there for IBD.
So when we're talking about biomarkers, in the very beginning, I said, if we can figure this out before the person gets IBD, like you said, that would be the holy grail for Crohn's. But what do people feel like clinically before they get these conditions? And, how would you ever, do people go to the doctor and say, oh, my stomach's starting to hurt me all the time? Or like what happens that would tell you that they're headed for trouble clinically? What would the patient experience?
It's not unusual that patients tell you about symptoms and trouble they have years before they have a manifestation. And the reason why I say that is because manifestation is obviously determined by diagnostic criteria. So I must have a finding, for example, endoscopy or a biopsy. And I would say, I recall I had a number of patients who have come to me and I did repeat colonoscopies on them, found nothing, and then suddenly, like it would be always there's a typical ulcer of Crohn's disease. And I say, patient had for 3-4 years symptoms and kept on coming, kept on being endoscoped. And 3-4 years later, third endoscopy, suddenly there is the macromorphologic damage, the ulcer. And the disease process obviously had started earlier. We couldn't detect it. The symptoms were already there. Patients also very often tell that in their families, there has been bowel symptoms, probably undiagnosed IBD. So we question them about their mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters. They tell you very often, oh, they have IBD, but my sister also never been diagnosed, but she also has always trouble. And my mother, I never know what was diagnosed, probably at that time wasn't diagnosed. She's now dead, but she also had a lot of trouble with the bowel. So I think symptoms shouldn't be underestimated. The idea that there's just a pure delay by insufficient diagnostic procedures is not true. It is because our diagnostic criteria are probably sometimes not right. We don't have anything better.
So is there any clear indication yet of what biomarkers are showing that someone has IBD or Crohn's, or that is headed towards it? When you say biomarkers, is it blood, stool, or is it microbiome?
Yeah. Everybody hopes it could be microbiome, but again, there is not the smoking gun change. Blood, I think, has disappointed earlier. So I think the idea of predicting who has inflammatory bowel disease is now driven by big family inception cohorts, where the children of patients or the first degree relatives of patients have a 30 to 40-fold risk above the normal population risk to develop IBD within a time of 10, 15 years. And these are long-term projects in which these patients undergo regular blood and stool sampling. And we all hope that with today's genomic and proteomic techniques, we find these early changes, but they haven't been defined yet.
Has it been defined at all? I mean, what has
been? There's some work on military recruitees where young men have been examined, obviously being healthy when they went to army. And later, there have been, again, the ones have been picked who 5-10 years later had inflammatory bowel disease. And then you have these serum samples back, obviously, from the recruitment period when they supposedly were healthy. That has been on Israel, has been repeated in the US. And there's certain, let's say, bacterial antibodies that are probably an epiphenomenon, but that show up in the serum of these people. But again, the diagnostic value of that is so bad that you cannot use that to identify the patients. And the hope is that you would have a biomarker which is so specific, has such a high predictive value, that it could do preemptive therapy before manifestation and avoid manifestation. But then you have to be sure that the person develops IBD. And as long as you're not sure with the right certainty, you cannot do these trials.
Well, okay. So what clinically, how do you establish for certain that someone has IBD or Crohn's?
There are clear diagnostic criteria. And those are typically endoscopic, histologic, radiologic changes, plus the symptoms. But these changes, I say, are macromorphologic. So if you bring this to a picture, it's like you diagnose problems in cars only if your fender is falling off.
So are we getting anywhere close to figuring out any biomarkers that,
I think yes. I think yes.
So
I think
what kind of biomarkers?
Yeah, the molecular biology around that has made the same leap forward as, say, pocket computers, who once filled an entire room. Now we have the iPhone, within 25 years. And the molecular biology is just started 10, 15 years ago and makes the same leap forward. So I think we are already able to do the genome for a few $100. Yeah, once it was hundreds of millions a few years ago. just 15 years ago. And so also genomics and proteomics do that same step. So yes, I am completely confident we're able to see these early markers of disease development in many diseases years ahead of the disease. So that's going to come and shape the next generation of children. For them, it will be commonplace if medicine can afford it in that society. But technically, it could be commonplace. I think what's now the game for the here and now in inflammatory bowel disease, we have a number of therapies that go deep into disease pathophysiology, so-called biologics and targeted therapies. But these therapies don't deliver the cure. They deliver maybe in 10, 20% of patients thorough benefit of disease control, but many others just disease improvement. And I think being able to tell earlier which therapy is best, be able to guide jumping to the next therapy, that's, I think, something where the biomarkers will deliver much earlier.
So how early do you think would be important for someone to discover that they're headed in the direction of IBD or Crohn's? And can we tell clinically from the first onset of any symptoms, how long is it until they have full-blown, Crohn's or IBD?
Oh, it typically takes between 1 and 2 years between the first onset of symptoms and the diagnosis. There are good data out on that average. And for the reason I said, it's difficult to shrink that. But as I said, the biggest problem is to start a therapy, and patients hang on a therapy that is not fully functional for them for years without being switched to the next one. And biomarkers to guide that process of switching, those are, I think, much clearer, much nearer than the predictive marker of disease onset.
Okay. So you said someone will have symptoms for, a year or more?
Yep.
Sometimes years?
Yep.
And they'll just pass them off as, I shouldn't eat
people
that.
Have diarrhea, lots of IBS people, irritable bowel syndrome, lots of other reasons. So I think just having symptoms that are so generic as the ones in inflammatory bowel disease doesn't give you the chance to diagnose. You need more than that.
At what point do you expect, if you're successful in finding a biomarker, how far ahead of time do you think you'll be able to help someone figure out if they have a problem?
Oh, ideally at birth, but probably it would be good if you could tell 3 to 5 years ahead of time what happens there.
Do you think, what role does diet play in this, or do you think it's genetic?
I think it's genetic, all about the risk profile, but the risk profile is carried by many people. And I think there could be even more IBD if you look at risk profiles. But something must have happened in the environment conditions, because obviously there wasn't hardly any disease before 1950. And then it came on and obviously multiplicated more or less in the Western countries. And now it's coming on in China and the Asian countries. So I think to me it looks like it's lifestyle change. Now, what makes out our lifestyle the biggest impact is probably diet. And that something must have happened to diet. You can tell by the fact that in the 70s and 80s, you remember the campaigns about people dying from hunger. Obviously now the world is much more densely populated. At that time it was 2 billion people, now we have 7 or 8. And still we can obviously feed all of them if we can distribute it. So our production for food has increased tremendously, but we must have done something to the food that we can produce so much. Now you can make a big list of changes in the food and obviously find many, many smoking guns that could have contributed to this effect. But who knows what it is, because it's not easy to prove an etiology for such a change. People say, for example, could it be that there is the cleanliness of food that gives us trouble? Maybe in earlier days, the food was not as well preserved. We didn't have enough because much more was destroyed. And even the one which we were eating had more microbiome on it. Today, the food is ultra clean. So maybe that's a problem. Who knows? Could be.
I want to talk a little bit about the conditions themselves. How different is IBD versus Crohn's? And what happens to someone that has the two?
So IBD is the overall category. So the two entities are ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. And these diseases are obviously pretty similar, but yet they differ in symptoms. And the difference in symptoms comes from some complications that are unique to the one disease but not the other. So with Crohn's disease, you can have fistulating disease and stenosis that obviously have obvious problems if you have them. And with ulcerative colitis, for example, you always have a distal disease. So your bloody stool is much more prevalent than Crohn's disease.
Also, ulcerative colitis, you said bloody stool more often than Crohn's, but Crohn's is what maybe.
In Crohn's, you have more the pain
pain
because of stenosis, more the fistula and the inflammatory problems.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
Stenosis meaning what? Narrowing of the
the
colon?
bowel can't pass the content anymore. that can go to the point when you die from bowel occlusion.
Jesus. Right. So ulcerative colitis and then Crohn's, are there any other major predominant intestinal diseases like these, or are these really the two big ones?
These are the two big ones in the group of inflammatory bowel disease. It's 99%.
If you have one, do you tend to get the other? Ulcerative colitis, does it lead to Crohn's?
That's an interesting question, which can be debated probably on a philosophical level. Now, these are two different diseases, obviously. People do a lot of work to determine whether the patient is the one or the other. On the other hand, you see phenotypes changing. And you do know patients, all of us who do that work in patients, know patients who have started with a very clear morphologic diagnosis of ulcerative colitis and then have changed phenotype. And some years later, somebody said, actually looking at this, there's not ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease. It matches now the criteria of Crohn's disease. So it has been very clearly documented that change occurs. And it's now a philosophical change whether we have a continuum, which we call IBD, and the outer ends of the spectrum are just a very clear Crohn's versus a very clear ulcerative colitis, or whether these are two diseases, and you also can have both, with sometimes the one more shining up than the other. But I think this is really semantic.
So we don't know if it's a continuum of disease and that they're the same thing or not?
If you look at genetics, it looks like continuum.
Oh, meaning there's no genetic difference between Crohn's and IBD?
There is genetic difference, but it's obviously like a smear. So that looks like, from genetics, it looks like inflammation is the main problem. Then you have inflammatory bowel disease. And then there's the extremes out on the two basically opposite ends, Crohn's versus ulcerative colitis. And if all your disease genes are skewed to the one end, then it's really clear Crohn's. And all your disease genes skewed to the other end, real ulcerative colitis. But that's the case for the fewest patients. Most patients are in between. And then they get the one or other diagnosis. That's what genetic tells you. Clinically, it's very clear. I would say 80% of patients can be put into the one or other corner. And then there are 20% of patients who trade off and change where the diagnosis is revised.
Oh, really? Okay. Does it affect certain, you said it was affecting Americans, now it's affecting the Chinese. Does it affect men and women differently? Does it, is there? Okay. How about average age or circumstance?
There are, I think, two peaks of occurrence. One is early adulthood, that is between the 20s, 30s, so second, third decade of life. That's when most patients manifest. And then there's a smaller peak somewhere around 50 or 60. And then very placative are those cases of pediatric inflammatory bowel disease. It's a small number, but obviously the child is hitting the age of 6, 8, 10, then obviously things are very, very bad. So there's a very placative subgroup.
And this happens more in adults than children, right? Or does one of the conditions happen more in children? The
overall picture is much more adults and children.
Has anyone done a massive study to look at the dietary habits of thousands of people that have and don't have these conditions?
Of course. But the study is obviously heavily contaminated by the fact that the disease developed between 1960 and say 1990, I would say, were the biggest increases, or in the US a little bit earlier than in Europe more after the Second World War. And during that time, everything changed. Cars, computers, cell phones, hygiene, number of toilets, refrigerators, food, and everything associates.
Well, I mean, this is a digestive issue. And it affects our digestion.
There was a big
why not focus on that?
They looked at the number of toilets in the house and the question whether you have warm water and whether you have central heating. And then associated very highly. And that paper led to a lot of discussion about urban lifestyle versus country lifestyle.
So have there been any correlates found, anywhere or no? It just goes back to the
There's too many correlates found. And they all correlate with a changing life.
Too many, okay. And some seem to be like they shouldn't correlate at all, but okay, there's many. What are some of the correlations that have been found that make no sense?
Number of power plants, the sealed surface, the sanitation of water. I think they make probably little sense. But again, these are all associations that have been described, and they all come together in a world that has heavily changed over the last 5 decades.
Is there anything interesting that would come from China? How has it changed, and when did these conditions start their onset in China?
Probably 10, 15 years ago. And China would be a fantastic laboratory to obviously look at the effect of single civilization factors. But the problem is you need a strong epidemiologic interest for that. And I think that's not built up in China. So that chance probably is largely missed.
So it would be a unique opportunity to study it, but there's not the interest there.
Yeah,
what percentage of
a central place like China with a monolithic, non-democratic regimen? Right. You could easily say, I take Outer Mongolia and I prevent them from modern life. And I take Beijing and I bring modern life. And I do experiment about lifestyle and modern diseases, not just Crohn's disease, also all the other civilization diseases, including MS and whatever. But I don't think it's done. And also there's no descriptive epidemiology in China. So they're not very good in describing things. Really?
Why? What do they do instead?
They don't finance that. I mean, it's all a question about grant financing.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Very strange.
If you do epidemiology, you have to take big bucks into your hands.
Yeah. What's the potential burden on China, do you think? If it's the same as the U.S. and there's the same incidence of these conditions, what percentage of the population do you think may be affected?
Probably less than the U.S. Or the numbers which I speculated about, 2 million UC patients, ulcerative colitis patients in China by 2030. If you look at 1 billion people, 2 million means just a lifetime prevalence of 0.2%. So that will be the US numbers. Even if it's just half of that, it's still 1 million patients in UC. So with these countries being so densely inhabited, so many people in there, obviously the impact will be huge, even if it will be not approaching the same level as in the West. But many things point to the same level as in the West. The Chinese have also now got NASH, they've got hypertension, they've got obesity, they adopt everything we have.
Really? Across all these conditions, I'm sure everyone's looking for a correlation. Is there any of them that you think that China will be willing to, study themselves or partner on, or are they just kind of a closed society and there's no help from them?
I think the Chinese do their own thing.
Yeah. That's too bad. So
these are nice things in a worldwide effort. Obviously, things would run smoother, but I don't think that things are set that way. There's too much money in health, and there's too much need in health that big countries partner this way. And we shouldn't underestimate also the strength of the Chinese in developing own medications and their own pharma industry. So they think they're on the road to also keep up in that place. The moment they make already the best computers, I think in a decade or two, they also will make a significant part of pharma.
So, you've been working on these conditions for quite a while. Where do you think that the answer is going to come from? Just all of a sudden we're going to be able to find a medication that's going to work, or where do you think the breakthrough in understanding is going to be?
I would think particular value will have those studies that are longitudinal, take the breadth of 10, 20 years, looking at children, looking at the onset of IBD, accompanying people from health into manifestation, family studies, finding good ways to start early with therapy at a moment when the disease by today's standards wouldn't have been diagnosed. That's, I think, one of the avenues I think is particularly largely likely to be successful. And then I think the chance, obviously, of human fantasy to invent things is also large. Much of the progress in medicine has been not on a linear stream. People just tried something and oops, it worked just because they had the chance, they had the invention, they just tried it and it worked. And I wouldn't be surprised, that's also happening here. It's a question of investment as well. I think you would invest the same money people have invested for the race to the moon. They could have also had a race to eradicate IBD or eradicate cancer. Remember, the idea of putting a rocket to the moon has engaged about 400,000 people with, I think, highly skilled workers, engineers, and so on. They've all been brought together in one big effort because everybody wanted to beat the Russians in the Cold War. So with the same effort, they want to beat the disease. I think you can do it.
What's even more problematic, though, is look with cancer. They spend
going
billions
to the moon
and billions.
Certainly was more problematic at the time when you didn't have a pocket calculator than killing cancer today.
Yeah, and yet it still hasn't happened. And then, same thing with Alzheimer's and neurodegenerative diseases.
You can make the list. You can make the list. And the question is, where's inflammatory bowel disease on that list? I don't think it's the top, but I don't think it's the bottom either. I think there's a tremendous suffering in the disease. There are some disease conditions that are worse, for example, multiple sclerosis, and then there are also some that are much less. So I think if we looked at society investment, it should come somewhere in the upper third of the list.
Well, very good. What do you think is going to be possible in the near term with these two conditions? Any breakthroughs coming, or is it just slow, steady understanding and progress?
I think the advent of molecular biology in the pharmaceutical industry has spurred the ability to develop new targeted medications, namely biologics, but also small molecules. And these find now their entry into clinical trials. So it's an enormous number of clinical trials coming in these conditions. And then there's a second interest, there's a microbiome interest. And if you want to understand the microbiome, you need a good disease to play with. And again, inflammatory bowel disease is a good disease because you can look at the mucosa and see your success. Is there less inflammation than before? And so I think these two movements come together, and I think they could indeed bring a benefit to inflammatory bowel disease more than other diseases, because it could become a lead example to show a proof of concept for some interventions. And so I think we see at the moment a lot of trials going on in late stages, and I would be confident that this brings us a big leap forward in the ability to treat disease. Probably the same way as psoriasis. Nobody would have thought that there are suddenly biologics out of psoriasis that blow out the disease in 90% of patients. It's an inflammatory skin disease. It's as polygenic, it's as colorful as IBD. And then there's an agent that stops it in 90%. Needs to be given continuously, but stops it. So one day of the future, not too far away, we'll see that agent also coming for IBD.
Yeah, hopefully so.
Well, very good. The disease dies down. Stomach, last thought to that. Stomach ulcer is a good one, yeah? When I was young, in my early days of training, stomach ulcer was a very bad condition, and people got had to undergo crippling operations. Little rods, resections, stomach resection, two-third resection, whatever, dumping syndromes after extensive intestinal resections. And there was a recurring ulcer disease, really, with perforations, or stenosis, the whole show of destroying people. And then somebody invented Helicobacter pylori. A bug could be killed. And today we still have some acid problems in the stomach, yes, but it's a mere reflection, nothing anymore like we had this time.
Well, hopefully the same happens for these conditions,
Okay.
One quick, what's the average age at which people, start to experience problems and have full-blown issues?
I think most people in the second and third decade of life.
Oh, 20s or 30s?
The 20s, 30s, typical age to develop that disease. And problems, of course, if you look deep into the heart of patients and you ask them, then they will tell you, I had some problem like 10, 15 years ago. But maybe if you get such a disease, you remember your problems. I would say typically more intense problems precede the development of disease by a year or two before it's diagnosed.
Okay, makes sense. Well, very good. Stefan, what's the best way for people to find out more about your work?
Look at our homepage at the University of Kiel and search for us. We have several also patient-oriented pages for lay people. You can join our studies. You can donate your blood. You can push the effort we do. And obviously, we are part of a big group here called an excellence cluster in inflammation. So we have received a lot of money from the government to understand also IBD as a systems disease. Indeed, we think that inflammation is a general phenomenon, and you fall too short if you just look at the gut or the skin or the joints. You have a look at the entirety of inflammatory problems and bring these diseases together under one umbrella. That's what we do in research and clinical. You can look at that at the Excellence Cluster Precision Medicine and Inflammation, PMI. Their webpage is out. And obviously, you can help us push forward.
Okay, very good. Well, Stefan, thank you for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Sure. Success to you, and thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.